traditional public schools knock it out of the park in many places. My guess is they'll continue to thrive, the ones that are good. And when you give parents choices, all schools get better. They don't get worse, they get better.
Governor Bush, thanks for joining us here at AEI.
You bet, Ned.
So I want to sort of get to school choice in a minute, which is sort of my bailiwick, but I'm curious to get into a little of your deep background as governor. When you were governor, you did have big pushes on school choice, but you also had the A+ plan, which had a lot of the hallmarks of what we think of as accountability today, but back before it was cool. So can you just give me a thumbnail on that, and what do you think were some of the biggest successes from that early
Well, this will sound like a bygone era, but when I ran for governor, I laid out what I wanted to do in education. I actually laid out the A+ plan in detail. It became the prominent, dominant issue of the campaign.
Right.
My opponent attacked me for it. I defended it. I won, and it gave me a mandate to do it, which is a lesson that I think policymakers and elected officials should remind themselves of from time to time.
And you were able to do it fairly quickly, right?
First year, most of it. So I went to visit 250 schools, kind of dehorned myself because I've always believed in vouchers, which at the time was, you know, very dangerous apparently. So the A+ plan was we would grade schools based on student learning, A, B, C, D, and F. And if a school was an F, they would be given a voucher. If they were F 2 years out of 4. And if they showed improvement, they would get $100 per student directly to the school, no cut from for the state or the school district.
Right.
We eliminated social promotion, and the next year we created the Opportunity Scholarship Program, the Corporate Tax Scholarship Program, and the McKay Scholarship Program, which were the first statewide voucher programs, kind of all within a 2- and 3-year period. And it was a big damn deal. I mean, it was tumultuous to say the least. And the lessons learned were that you've got to fund your priorities first. You can't have provocative policy without backing it up with money. 2, you've got to not just create in terms of accountability, you can't just say, here are our expectations, now go do it. You got to help people that have never actually been held to account. And so we focused on struggling schools and providing resources. The system adapted to this in a dramatic way.
One of my key questions is you put in a particular, pretty toothsome requirement that if 3rd graders couldn't pass their reading benchmarks, they weren't going to 4th grade. And I'm curious about how that works, in large part because I see in a number of places we have really lofty ambitions, and instead of seeing sort of toothsome requirements, oftentimes we see people padding their numbers to get, you know, sort of the numbers.
You have exemptions that are Mack truck wide.
Yeah, exactly. So how'd that go? That's the first question. How'd that go? It sounds like
we went from 32% of students being level 1, which I would call functionally illiterate, below basic readers, to 14% in a 2-year period. But we had 14% of our kids held back. In the 2nd year, which is you know, it's a pretty provocative idea.
Right.
But the net result was that. So we created this gate and said, we're not kidding. We're not going to have big Mack truck-wide exemptions. But we did summer school again. We put reading coaches in every school to teach teachers how to teach reading. We gave reading certificates to teachers to get additional pay. We implemented early childhood education, all of which, you know, together created improved literacy and lower number of functionally illiterate kids. It was in my re-election effort where, had we not made those appreciable gains that I described, had we maintained the status quo, had nothing changed, it would have been, you know, 25% or 30% of all 3rd graders stuck in 3rd grade. That would have been really ugly.
So you know, since then, there's been a lot of accountability water under the bridge, right? We've had No Child Left Behind. We've had the Obama era waivers, Race to the Top. Now we're at ESSA, and we've had Common Core. There's so many things. Knowing what you know now and have learned about these lessons, what do you wish that you had known back when you passed A+ that you didn't know then?
You know, the A+ plan worked. In reality, there were imperfections for sure, but it worked. So one of the things that was so helpful was that we built a database in our state. Researchers use it all the time to kind of study education outcomes on a longitudinal basis. We were blessed with a data bank that allowed us to adjust and kind of anticipate where we would go. So cut scores kind of turn out to be important in accountability.
Yeah, they do, huh?
Yeah, I mean, really important. And if you can kind of anticipate where you go so that you don't have you have a bell curve instead of everybody's an A or everybody's an F, that's important. And we had good data to be able to move us towards rising student achievement. Along the way, there was a lot of wavering. Not so much in my administration, but after, there's always a reason not to move it up a notch.
Right.
And then we've basically, I think, as a nation, we had some significant gains. Not because of me, but during my time as governor, many states had gains. Now we've seen a kind of a flatlining because there's a push against accountability, principally because testing is, bad, I guess, in the minds of people. And the reason is that we over-test. There's all sorts of tests that local school districts require that aren't part of the statewide accountability system in these states. And it's almost as though it's designed to end up really hurting accountability. So our foundation advocates fewer tests, more relevant tests, and more information from those tests to turn it into a diagnostic tool.
That's interesting. Let me ask you this sort of juxtaposition between, as a bridge to the talk about choice programs. A lot of public school accountability could be seen as increasing regulation on public schools. And then on the other hand, we have private school choice proposals, and a lot of the times we say, we need a light regulatory touch here. How can you explain to people why you can hold both those things in your hands at the same time?
I don't think accountability is regulation. Regulation is the number of, cafeteria workers you have to have per X number of students, or imposing another mandate on top of schools because there was an isolated tragic case of whatever. That's the state mandates that local school districts have every right to complain about. Accountability is actually liberating people. We try to create an environment. Look, we want rising student achievement, and here's how we're going to measure it. You go out and do your work, and we'll fund it, and we'll help you. So I would distinguish between traditional education regulation and accountability. Now, the private, there is a friction in school choice programs, the private programs, because you don't want to impose rules on top of private schools to make them basically look like traditional public schools. And we've always struggled with, do you test if someone takes public money? Do you disclose it when there's only 10 kids? There's a lot of details in this and nuance that gets worked out different ways by states. But the basic premise is that you're transposing this top-down bureaucracy and rulemaking process that's been around for 100 years in the traditional public schools to parents to make this decision for themselves. As long as you give them the right information and they know how their kid is doing, I think that that's appropriate.
Right. So you're you support a number of private school choice programs, all of them, and you support charters as well. I have a lot of folks who really like charter schools, and they say, charters are enough. Charters are enough. We don't need these private school choice programs. What would you say to them? Why would you say we do need private school choice?
I've met a lot of people that are, love high-performing charter schools in the inner city, and there's some phenomenal schools that just really hit it out of the park. Yeah. But it's not a zero-sum game. Advocating support of archdiocese schools in New York City does not hurt Success Academy. Yeah, it's truly not a question of one or the other. In fact, they live side by side, and if they're both flourishing, all the better.
So we just had this event upstairs talking about education savings accounts, which I've spent a great deal of time studying. I want to ask you a couple of questions about those, but for the viewers that may not know what they are, can you just kind of describe them?
They vary, but they're basically accounts that parents receive. They receive literally an account of money, depending on what's appropriated, to be able to choose going to a private school or to break it up, disaggregate it, as you said upstairs, big word.
Yeah.
We
like big words around here. It's a think tank.
AEI, I know. tutoring, to after-school programs, all sorts of other uses. In Florida, the principal ESA program that is really successful is the Gardner Scholarship Program, named after the former president of the state Senate, who was the sponsor of the bill. And now 10,000 parents or students, their parents get to choose from, and they get, I think, up to $10,000. So it's a robust amount of money, and it can be to keep your child in the school, a traditional public school, but get additional services. Those services, by the way, under the federal law, should be provided. Right. But as you might know, the federal law isn't always implemented in a faithful way, and a lot of parents are very frustrated that the public schools don't, their individual education plan that the law requires be met isn't being met. So this is a way for them to take that power and implement it on their own.
Sure. And ESAs, or Education Savings Accounts, ESAs, are sort of the new kid on the block as far as it comes to school choice programs. We have tax credit scholarships, and so and we have traditional voucher programs. What is it that they bring that is just totally different than these other forms?
The main difference is that you're empowering, the money goes to parents to choose how they spend it on behalf of their children. There's restrictions, of course, but it's different than a kind of a binary choice of going to the traditional school that your kid was already going to, or a private option. ESAs give you the choice of going to a private school, staying in a public school, and using private services along the way. So it's a much more dynamic, flexible tool for parents to help their children learn.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It raises the question of the supply side. We can do a lot about the demand side by giving families money and ways to use it that they otherwise wouldn't. But it's sort of harder to develop a supply side of providers who are going to kind of meet those demands. If you just have school choice, well, it's obvious that schools rise up. With ESAs, you need all kinds of different providers. What have you seen in Florida and in other states in your work with the Foundation for Excellence in Education that give you the confidence that the supply side will respond?
Well, supply side always responds to demand. I mean, it's kind of how free market economics work. Unfortunately, this is not a free market in the sense that if there's capital cost, really the principal cost for developing private alternatives, and there you have to be creative. And so if you gotta raise capital, you have to identify buildings and provide support for that. It's a challenge, but ultimately what we found was that as our corporate tax scholarship program, McKay scholarship program, Gardner scholarship program went from literally zero to now 150,000 students, that new schools were formed and supply ultimately met the need. And there's still big waiting list of kids that are trying to get into these programs.
Right. Now, a lot of these programs are going to be state programs, but they're going to run into the school finance structure, which is we have local dollars. I've got some dollars from my state, and across the nation, there's about 10% federal funding, 45% state, 45% local, right? Well, if you're a state making rules with 45% of your money to try and provide real educational opportunities for kids, you're stuck in a pretty good jam if you can't come up with the funds to give people a valuable voucher or ESA. Can you just speak to that challenge?
Sure. So in the case of our programs, the largest voucher program is the corporate tax scholarship program, and it's less per student than the traditional public school option. So in effect, every child that leaves the public school to go to the private school is saving the state money. Sure. And there's a growing understanding of that which sustains these programs. So on the one hand, and in Florida we have a merging of our local and state funding, which makes this much easier.
Yeah, it does.
So in the states that don't have that, you're going to have to appropriate money. The Gardner program is a separate line item in appropriation, which gets to the basic point. If it's a high priority, it ought to be first funded.
Right.
Washington doesn't work this way, but most states, if a governor says, this is my #1 priority, you take the first monies to fund your first priorities. And so we weren't constrained. Other states, you know, where it's a big fight in the legislature, really are hampered by this, for sure.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question from your perspective as head of the Foundation for Excellence in Education. So can you just tell our viewers what is the foundation and what's its mission?
Sure. It was formed in 2007. It started as a place where we could tell the Florida story, which is really a story of choice, accountability, and a focus on early childhood literacy, and the combination of all this yielding rising student achievement, which is ultimately what matters. So, but we've morphed into still telling that story, and we go state by state to policymakers, to in the legislature and in the executive branch, kind of forewarning them of the mistakes that we might have made, which is always helpful, not to remake the mistakes that others have made, and encouraging them to be big and bold, and providing support when they do, and then helping them and guide them on implementation. This is complex stuff.
Yeah.
So whether it's testing or just basically the science of reading, or making sure that accountability system is done the right way where it's not going to blow up in your face the next year. We've had states that have ignored our advice in that regard, and it blew up in the the next year, and they had to start over. It's we want to be a trusted advisor. We don't big dog it, show up at a place and take credit. We operate with typically with chambers and with local and state-based policy institutes to do this in partnership, always being deferential to the leaders that take the, to have to do the courageous thing, which is to advocate, whether you're a governor or a member of the legislature.
Sure. So taking Florida off the table for obvious reasons, what other state is just knocking it out of the park in terms of education generally, but private school choice programs, charters? Who do you think is really doing great?
I'd say Arizona has a robust charter school program and a burgeoning private school program. Governor Ducey is a big and bold leader. Brian Sandoval did something extraordinary, but the legislature changed, and I don't think he got it off the ground to make it completely sustainable, because there's not enough scale yet. But he had a full-throated ESA.
Yeah.
Wow, I mean that's about the ultimate thing. So huge credit for making that big first step. Indiana has kind of followed the footsteps of Florida and done some things even bigger. So Louisiana, although there's every state kind of ebbs and flows. Tennessee has had big learning gains with a focus on teacher preparation and public school choice. So there's some good states out there. Colorado is a place where actually bipartisan consensus has emerged from time to time. It's one of the few states where there's not a big...
That still exists?
Yeah, well, apparently in Colorado, it's the water up there, or maybe that new initiative that passed.
Elevation, maybe. I don't know.
It's every state's different, and Mississippi's a place where, starting really from nothing, Governor Bryant's done a really good job of. They've passed, or they're passing an ESA. There's big support in the business community and the political leadership for meaningful efforts there. And they're focused on reading, and they didn't have a charter school program until recently. So depending on where you are on the spectrum of change, these are big steps. And we help each state kind of uniquely based on where they are. So
you support vouchers, you support online education, you support ESAs, charter schools, and these are all worthy of support, but they all do inevitably leave students away from traditional school districts and neighborhood schools.
Right.
A lot of people will say, well, that's because you hate neighborhood districts and traditional public schools. If that's not the case, as these things grow and they succeed, what do you see as the future for traditional school districts and neighborhood schools?
Well, neighborhood schools particularly, I think, aren't going away because they have broad support among moms and dads, just because of the convenience and the safety factor. Parents have lots of reasons why they support their children going to particular schools. It's not always the way the bean counters and the bureaucrats suggest. And so traditional public schools will always be well funded. Will there be a little bit of stress because the long-term pension obligations, the sins of the past, put pressure on school districts? Yeah, but so what? You know, I mean, if you go to some states, more money's being spent to deal with the pension obligations decided 20 years ago. Classroom education has languished, even though they spend double what a state like Florida spends. Yeah. Is that fair? The fact that we were more disciplined in how we went about it, should we bemoan the fact that states are going to have to make some adjustments? No, I mean, that's part of what I think is an important element of a 21st century education system, to move away from this industrial model that has failed in the private sector and would have failed already in the public sector had it not been for all of us paying our taxes to sustain something that's not as efficient as it needs to be. But traditional public schools knock it out of the park in many places, and my guess is they'll continue to thrive, the ones that are good. And when you give parents choices, all schools get better. They don't get worse, they get better.
So there's a number of private school or just choice options, right? There's public school choice and charters. We have ESAs, tax credit scholarships, vouchers, and a number of different kinds of programs. So let me present you with a false forced choice. If you had to choose one to bet on, what's your favorite program of these?
I mean, if you created a statewide ESA program and you created a repository of options for parents, and there was some degree of transparency about their effectiveness and what the price was and all the things that a consumer of something of that importance would need, and you had accountability around it, which would be different than the traditional accountability, so that parents would know what was working and what wasn't. That to me would be the ideal situation. I mean, if a girl could dream, it would be to turn parents, well-informed parents with accurate, transparent information into the school districts.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing. Of course, you can't have a vibrant marketplace of educational service providers without developing an information system that gives feedback to consumers. And of course, you can't get that system up until you have the vibrant system. But what do you think states should think about as they're trying to develop that and trying to just grease those gears?
I think that's what they need to think about is if you pass a voucher bill or a expanded charter, any expansion of the parents are ultimately accountable for their children's education. You've got to, along the way, at the same time, simultaneously give them a system of real information. You know, as I mentioned upstairs, that's a place where generally the governments have failed. Yeah. They just don't think that way. They're insular in their nature. They've never had to market. You know, they've never had to actually learn how to present something in a way that a mom and a dad would understand how they're doing. In fact, in some cases, they don't want you to know, because if kids aren't learning, it's not like a great conversation.
That's true. Keep it quiet. Indeed.
Well, that's how do you get to a place where you have someone graduating with a high school diploma with an 8th grade level reading capability. Yeah. How do you get to the point where a significant percentage, 40–50% of kids aren't college and or career ready? More than that, actually. They have to retake, if they go to college, they have to retake high school reading and high school math. The only way you do it is that you've kept it quiet. Because no mom would say, well, that's great. Yeah. My little Johnny went 12 years and is a 9th grade reader. Woohoo!
Yeah, not a lot to cheer about. Let me ask you about advice for legislators or governors that are trying to develop an ESA in their state. Now, of course, these are going to go through the push and pull of making legislation, the sausage making, and they have to compromise, sometimes on price, sometimes on how many people are eligible, sometimes on what kind of regulation they're going to cover. Where would you say, if you're developing an ESA bill, you can't compromise on what? Where can they not afford to compromise on?
I think it's making sure that there's going to be private providers opting in, which means price. It would be better to cap the number and go back to fight again the next session of raising the cap, but making sure that this amount of money, while lower than the per student public school, it always should be lower than that. Right. But it's enough to be able to attract high quality providers into the arena.
And so why would you say it should always be lower quality, not lower quality, a lower amount of money than what is spent in the local public schools? I just follow up on that.
Because any transformation, in life outside of government, innovation normally costs less and yields a better result. Right. And we should apply that model, I think, rather than the you know, the tired old model, it costs more money. More money isn't the leading indicator of a better result. And plus politically, if you're going to go propose, I got this great idea. I'm going to propose a voucher that is double the cost or 50% more or 25% more than the per student funding. By the way, because it's private, we're not going to impose all these rules on top of them. So, you know, we don't know exactly if it's going to be perfect. You're not going to get that passed any state legislature.
A number of people that I know or am familiar with, they will criticize private school choice programs on equity grounds. They will say, well, you know, this is the people who are going to take advantage of this are disproportionately white or rich or something else.
The private school choice program?
Yes, and so how do you respond when you hear arguments like that?
It's just not true. It's not true at all. Every data point suggests otherwise. Most of these programs are taken advantage of by lower income people. The programs for children with learning disabilities are pretty, you know, across the spectrum, both higher income and lower income, but there's no disproportionate that I'm aware of, whether it's charter schools or private voucher programs. The exact opposite's true, that people, because of how the programs are typically crafted, people of lower income benefit from these programs. The issue that I think is important is to make sure that parents that are, you know, a single mom that's struggling with 2 jobs and sees this as a chance for their child to rise up and to be successful, to go to a private school, that they're informed, that they get the proper information. You know, that to me is a bigger issue. If you're in a more affluent area and you have the information available and you can seek it out and you have a network of community that can just kind of by the tom-toms tell you what teacher's good, what school's good. If you don't have all that, then I think it's the obligation of the state to provide that information to level out the playing field.
Right. So private school choice has a friend in the White House and at the Department of Education that they never really had. You know, charters have had support from the administration before, but not private school choice. But private school choice has grown in state capital after state capital. It has not been Washington, D.C. that's been pushing it. So do you think that this new support from the administration is going to be a change in that? And how might states make good on that new support in D.C.?
Well, it could be that there'd be a federal voucher program emerge in the welfare reform or the fight against poverty that emerges in Paul Ryan's world this year. I don't know. That would be wonderful to include it, because empowering parents that are near or at the poverty level with more choices in education would be a key element of that. I'm a little wary of it, only in that it should not hurt the existing choice programs that exist across the country. It should enhance them. There should be enough flexibility that if the federal government wants to provide support, which states that already have these voucher programs and school choice programs would love to have, it shouldn't be with so many strings attached that it stifles the work that's already being done. So my guess is that we'll continue on this path, that this is really a state issue, locally administered. The federal government has, with Betsy DeVos, certainly is a strong advocate of accelerating school choice programs across the country, and hopefully she could be a partner. But I cannot imagine a time when the Trump administration, with Secretary DeVos's input at least, would make it harder for the existing choice programs to prevail.
Jeb Bush, thanks for coming to AEI and talking to us.
You bet. Thanks.
Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with Governor Jeb Bush. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint. And to learn more about education savings accounts, check the links in the description below.